Rest. It wasn't written after he was set free, so it was activities of people like Hamish that helped keep alive the freedom and justice struggle. And of course, as Hamish knew, it doesn't end. We're still having to do that. Well, our first speaker tonight is Larry Flanagan. Sorry, I've not been using this. I hope you've been able to hear me. So, our first speaker tonight is Larry Flanagan, whom I saw on Newsnight Scotland last night.
Hey.
So I thought, oh, that's the man I'm going to speak to now. He is that very, very important person, the EIS General Secretary. And apparently he's unique for having also been a classroom teacher. And coming from Govan, he was Councillor for Castle Milk in the 80s and 90s and was active in the anti-apartheid movement and the struggle for majority rule in South Africa. So I'll give you Larry Flanagan.
I thought I'd lost my bottle of water, I just realised where I put it. Well, good evening, colleagues and comrades. It's a privilege to join you this evening as part of the Edinburgh People's Festival and to be invited to deliver the Hamish Henderson Memorial Lecture. And I genuinely thank you very much for the opportunity. I have to admit that when Colin approached me and asked me to speak tonight, I suggested to him I wasn't particularly well qualified to deliver a memorial lecture in relation to Hamish, as I never knowingly met Hamish, although I'm sure we were at lots of events together. And even in terms of his output, my acquaintance with his work was largely through a few songs rather than even his poetry. Colin assured me, and I'm not sure whether he was really keen to get me to speak or really keen to avoid having to find somebody else to take my place, but he assured me that the personal detail of Hamish's life had been well covered in the first few of the lectures since they started in 2002, and a kind of broader focus on some of the themes of his life, in particular his great sense of internationalism, would be entirely appropriate. So that's the kind of approach I'm going to take, but it has been immensely interesting to research some of the biographical detail of Hamish's life. I'm not actually unique as General Secretary of the IS in having been a teacher. Most of them have been a teacher at some point. I'm the first General Secretary who has come straight from the classroom to General Secretary, so I've been a trade union bureaucrat for a year, and prior to that I was a classroom teacher for 33 years. So I didn't kind of work my way up through the ranks in terms of the official structures. Most of my working life has been as an English teacher in Glasgow. And as an English teacher, I was never greatly concerned with biographical detail in relation to writers. I always thought sometimes biographical detail overwhelmed the text, so I don't really care who wrote Shakespeare's plays as long as we've actually got the words and we can look at the text. However, in saying that, I found Hamish's biography, his life story, to be entirely engrossing in its own right, irrespective of his output. And I'm sure you're familiar with the details. I know Colin had it in the programme. I'm not going to dwell on a lot of it, but born in 1919 to a single parent mother and orphaned at an early age, one of the first things that struck me was the way in which he managed, through achieving a scholarship, to use education in order to map out his future life and go on to graduate from Cambridge University. And as a teacher, looking back to that time and looking at education now, I think the whole idea that education is a pathway for young people to find their own identity, their own voice, their own sense of self, is as true now as it was when Hamish took advantage of the scholarship which he had managed to achieve. As a multilingualist, he served during the Second World War, and that was an event, an experience that shaped the lives of many of his generation in terms of their outlook and their future pathways in life. In Hamish's case, it was a catalyst for some of his finest poetry. and in particular the elegies which have been published. And I haven't actually got a copy of the book yet, so I've read a number of them online. But it's very clear from it that Hamish's sense of humanity shines through the poetry that he wrote from that period, capturing the experience of both sides of the conflict, in the sense of there being a single humanity there, and the German dead as well as the Allied dead being important to him. One set of lines that he wrote in relation to a dead German soldier, he said, "Here's another good Jerry." Good Jerry at that time being the only good German, being a dead one. He then follows that up with the colloquialism, or the Scots, "Poor mucker." And just in that simple phrase, you get a sense of the sense of comradeship and kinship that, as an observer, he felt for the fallen soldier. And then the pathos of a wasted life in the simple phrase, "just 18." And when I read those lines, as someone who enjoys poetry, I immediately wanted to find the rest of his work. And it is interesting, an interesting aside, that here's me, an English teacher in Scottish schools for over 30 years, and at the age of 57 I'm coming across some of the finest poetry that's been written by a Scots poet, but which is still very much hidden in terms of the school curriculum, for example, and the wider society. He goes on to write in relation to the fallen dead of both sides. No blah, no hypocrisy about their sacrifice, rather tears, or reveling of the time that took them, than an insult so outrageous. All barriers are down, in the criss-cross enclosures where most lie now, assembled in their aching solitude, those others lie too, who were also the sacrifice of history's great rains, of the destitute transitions. This one beach, where high seas have disgorged them like flotsam, reveals in its nakedness their ultimate alliance. So the fallen dead from both sides, united in death. And as I say, I've come across these lines very recently, but they speak to me of a profoundly insightful spirit of a man who had a deep concern for humanity. And Colin mentioned in his introduction the post-war period, and that great well of hope that accompanied the return of a Labour government and the introduction of major reforms like the NHS, and an institution that we are still defending. And if you're around Manchester on September the 29th, we are marching on the Tory conference in defence of the NHS, because it's something we don't want to lose. But in that period of optimism, Hamish became the driving force behind the revival of the folk music scene in Scotland, seeking out the DNA of the Scottish character in the music, song and words of the various peoples of Scotland. And alongside that, accompanied by a commitment to radical socialism. So, as I say, as I was researching it, it's clearly an interesting life, and one which rightly deserves to be remembered here tonight. One of the interesting comments I came across in my reading was from Donald Smith. I don't know, might be here tonight. I thought I'd better attribute it to him in case he was actually sitting in the audience. But he was talking about Hamish's striving for, particularly in relation to the songs that he wrote, striving for an anonymity rather than a personal imprint. And Donald Smith described this as an attempt to mimic the style of folk music, where any characters which are in a song are there as representatives of a group of people. The idea of not about individuals or heroes or celebrity, but about the lives of ordinary people. And I thought that was very interesting, and it reminded me, I'm doing some work just now with the Jimmy Reid Foundation, and I've been looking at some of the archive material in relation to Jimmy Reid. And one of the clips that I enjoyed seeing again in relation to Jimmy Reid was he was standing outside a block of a multi-storey block in Glasgow, talking about the unearthed geniuses which might well dwell in these buildings, but had never been given the opportunity or the platform in order to realise their talents, and they remained unsung heroes, as it were. And I think one of the things about the approach that Hamish Henderson took in relation to folk music was about recognising that sense of the dignity and the honour that abounds in ordinary lives, in the lives of ordinary people. I don't know if it's an age thing, but I've taken recently to reading the obituaries in the Herald, and you sometimes skip over them quite quickly after the first couple of paragraphs, but every so often you come across an ordinary person whose family have put in the obituary, and you read through some of the things that the person has experienced, some of the particularly older people, and I am constantly struck by how extraordinary ordinary lives actually are when you examine them. Lived without great fanfare, lived often without great recognition beyond immediate family. Norman McCaig, the Scots poet, in one of his poems commented on how extraordinary ordinary things are and how ordinary extraordinary things are. And I think that's a sentiment which recognises the dignity of our lives, of everyday life, and a sentiment I'm sure from what I've learned of Hamish that he would happily echo. I mentioned Hamish's commitment to socialist ideas, and we've heard reference already to his sense of internationalism, as has been indicated by the introductory song there. In Hamish's case, this manifested itself strongly in his anti-apartheid activity. And Tessa mentioned that when Nelson Mandela visited the city of Glasgow in 1993 to receive the freedom of the city which had been bestowed upon him in 1981, Hamish was a requested member of the welcoming party, and what was a great day for Scotland. Mandela made a speech in George Square, and in that kind of sonorous voice that he has, he said, "People of Glasgow, you refuse to forget our plight." And on to say, "The people of Glasgow were the first in the world to confer on me the freedom of the city. At a time when I and my comrades in the ANC were imprisoned in Robben Island, serving life sentences which in apartheid South Africa then meant imprisonment until death." And then he paused, and then he said, "People of Glasgow, I am now free to be with you." And it was an electrifying moment for those of us who were in George Square at that time. And if anyone ever needed validation of the importance of international solidarity work with struggle abroad, then I would reference that day. It's an inspiring memory that those of us who were there certainly share. Tessa also mentioned that I was a Glasgow District Councillor in the 80s, and I actually should have been part of the welcoming group in relation to the Mandela celebrations, because I was convener of I think it was called the Subcommittee on the Disinvestment in Apartheid South Africa. It was a subcommittee which looked at at that time Glasgow's funds were invested in all sorts of companies, and the boycott was on. So we were systematically going through the accounts to try and disinvest from South Africa. And I had moved in the Labour group, I'd written a letter in the Labour group to rename St George's Place as Nelson Mandela Square, and drafted the the declaration that Glasgow published in relation to apartheid. Effectively was acting as the Labour group's spokesperson. The 80s was also the time of the anti-poll tax campaign, as some of you will remember. And early in my council career, I was largely associated with the militant group in the Labour Party. So early in my council career, along with a number of colleagues, I'd been suspended from the group for a year because we had walked out when we tried to get the first poll tax. And we got back into the group and were told to behave ourselves. And then at one point, I don't know if you remember all this stuff around registration, but the Strathclyde Regional Registration Officer had demanded that Glasgow City Council handed over the files with all the housing benefit records, so that those people who were on housing benefit could be tracked down and registered for the poll tax because they were avoiding paying it. And we had a huge discussion in the Labour group, and we actually won the vote to refuse to hand over these files. Although we were threatened with being surcharged and so forth, but what actually happened was that the group leader, who should have been nameless, decided that he wasn't happy that he'd lost the vote and walked out and resigned, and a number of people ran after him and got him to come back, and they retook the vote, and we lost. And we were then told we were to support the Labour whip when it went to committee. A number of us decided we would vote with the original decision rather than the second one, and subsequently we were suspended again. Now, those who weren't suspended the first time round got a year, and that included a couple of colleagues who went on to become Labour MSPs, Bill Butler, Frank McAvey. But those of us who'd been suspended the first time, because it was our second offence, we were suspended sin die. Sin die, as I would say it. I was actually told last year by Ronnie Smith, who's my predecessor as the IS General Secretary, that the correct way to say it is sine die. And I said, sure. Ronnie's a linguist, and he said, yes. He said, is that not just the way they say it in Edinburgh? He said, no. I said, that's the way they say it in the entire Latin-speaking world. And I said, well, in Glasgow we say sin die. It has a greater sense of finality. So I was suspended sin die from the Labour group, which meant I lost all my convenerships, which meant that when they drew up the names to meet Mandela on that day in George Square, I was standing in the crowd, which was not a bad place to be because it was a magnificent day. But if I had to admit to one small regret about the stance on the poll tax, it was that I missed out on that chance to be on the platform in that party. And it would have been nice, I think, it would have been interesting to witness at close hand the meeting between Hamish and Nelson. Although it's not difficult, I think, to imagine it, because it seems to me that there would have been a great deal of warmth, a great deal of humility, and a great deal of humanity in that coming together of those two individuals. And that issue, that last sentiment there, the issue, the sense of humanity, that's been a recurring theme in my studies for tonight's lecture. It's a sense I have of both men, neither of whom I've met, but I'm convinced that both have or had a deep, compassionate interest in the lives of individuals, in the lives of ordinary people. And as I say, it's reflected in Hamish's work, in the folk revival and focus on real lives, and in his poetry. And it's the hallmark of the persona of Nelson Mandela, a man of such stature and dignity that undoubtedly he will leave the world a poorer place when he passes. I'm sure a number of us in the room, our own sense of internationalism, well, certainly those of you of a similar age to myself, would have manifested itself in the anti-apartheid movement, although there are a huge range of causes. And next month we come to the 40th anniversary of the Chilean coup. And in the 70s, if you were involved in the labour movement, you'd be involved in Chile solidarity campaigns and working with Chilean refugees. I know as a school student, before I developed any real sense of politics, I had a very strong notion that in South Africa a system based on skin colour was an affront to any sense of society that I could envisage. And And I watched on TV as a young boy the demonstrations at the cricket, Peter Hain and so forth, and I understood exactly why they were angry and why they were protesting. I didn't quite understand why so many people went to cricket matches. In the first place, I understood the notion of protest. And as I said, South Africa has come a long way since then. I think it has challenges ahead of it still, and international solidarity remains important. In the 80s I developed two very strong relationships with South African comrades who were working in exile and living in Britain at the time. On their return to South Africa at the end of apartheid, they became involved in the struggle back home. Nowadays, one of them is a Rand millionaire, and when she went back, she was appointed to the board of one of the mining companies as a trade union nominee, and somehow over the course of 20 odd years she's become a Rand millionaire. The other, I know, continues to fight for his belief in a socialist South Africa. So I think there are still huge challenges in relation to the future for South Africa. There are huge issues there in relation to poverty and to a number of challenges. And as I say, that's why I think the work that we do in terms of solidarity, whether it's through AXA or whether it's through other organisations, remains absolutely essential. Internationalism, it seems to me, is a duty for all of us who feel that we're involved and committed to the labour and trade union movement. Internationalism acts as a counter to what might be described as petty nationalism, as the kind of chauvinism that imbues the history of Britain, and which still feeds into the racism we see demonstrated by groups such as the EDL and the SDL, groups that we have to continue to campaign against. We have a referendum coming up in Scotland. Nationalism in its various forms will be examined in a number of different ways. I'm here tonight invited as EIS General Secretary. We have, as a union, decided our position is that we're not taking a position in relation to the referendum, acknowledging the fact that we have members who will be voting yes and members who will be voting no. So we're keen to promote the debate, but not commit ourselves politically when we are a non-political organisation. So I'll not abuse the invitation by giving you my own personal view, but one of the subjects of one of Henshaws' most famous and rousing songs was John Maclean and the John Maclean March, and I've always admired the politics of John Maclean, who seemed somehow to manage to combine a sense of nationalism with internationalism, because he tied them together with a commitment to a socialist outlook, a resolute socialism. So, without giving away any secrets, John Maclean might be a good role model to consider. Maclean, of course, was a teacher, a dominee. And one of the things I've discovered since becoming a bureaucrat is that our headquarters in Murray Place, around 3 floors of it, are basically a filing archive. We have records going back. We're the oldest teacher trade union in the world, and we have records going back since the very beginning. And I have assiduously been searching through them to see if John Maclean was ever a member of the EIS, because I would be delighted to discover that he was. We're a Scottish-based trade union. We organise only in Scotland. But we are also part of an organisation called Education International, which is a worldwide federation of teacher trade unions. And we are often called to support internationally teachers in other areas, sometimes in terms of supporting their industrial action. Over the last 6 or 7 months, we've supported teachers in Swaziland who have been dismissed for taking strike action against the government employers. And in Greece, we have constantly been supporting the Greek teacher unions in relation to the loss of over 3,000 teacher jobs because of austerity programme. Earlier this year, 69,000 teachers in Denmark, almost on the anniversary of the Dublin lockout, found themselves locked out for best part of 10 days, where the government closed down the schools and wouldn't let people go to work. And just recently in Chicago, 30,000 teachers were on strike for 7 days in a dispute with the council. So, you know, as a trade union, we're involved in international solidarity work, but we're also committed to internationalism in a positive way. We set aside 1% of all our dues to fund international solidarity work. And, for example, we've been supporting the emergence of new teacher trade unions in the Baltic states, and we're keen to support educational initiatives around the world. Mandela, in one of his many comments in education, said that education is pardon me, education is the most powerful. I'm glad I found the water. Education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. And I'd like to just finish off by referring to some examples of why international solidarity is essential. Last year, for example, we were called upon to support Turkish teacher trade unionists after the police had raided the homes and offices of trade unionists in over 20 cities. 71 activists were arrested and imprisoned, including 15 members of the Teachers Trade Union. In October of last year, Education International launched an appeal for $6.5 million US dollars, and that was to support the education of refugee children from Syria who had fled across the borders in order to escape the violence in Syria. In Bahrain, the General Secretary of the Bahrain Teachers Association remains in jail following a failed appeal. Madi Abudid was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment in 2011 on totally trumped up charges. His real crime was campaigning for basic trade union rights and human rights. He's managed the campaign has managed to get the sentence cut to 5 years, but after 2 years in jail, he has another 3 years still to go. The Deputy General Secretary has just been released after 3 years in jail. In March of this year, on Tuesday the 26th in Pakistan, Janice Nazli, a 41-year-old teacher, was shot 300 metres from the school in which she taught. Her head teacher took her to the hospital, but she died 3 hours later. And the reason why she was murdered was because she championed the right of girls to an education in that country. And you might think that something like that would cause a wave of revulsion, but only a week later in Karachi, in the Baldia town school, grenades were thrown into the playground. The head teacher was killed, and several pupils badly injured, again on the issue of girls' education. In fact, around the world today, 32 million girls are denied the right to education. And as I say, the quote from Mandela, education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. You may be interested that Gordon Brown has taken on a UN role as a special envoy and is campaigning on the issue of access to education. There's a website set up and they're looking for support. They have a target of getting the 61 million children who are denied education into schools over the next 3 years. You'll also be aware, colleagues, of the heroic stance of Malala Yousafzai, who was a young girl who was shot by the Taliban. I saw footage recently of Malala speaking at, it was a kind of UN youth conference, a kind of special conference for young people. And she spoke of her determination to champion the right and the cause of girls' education. And it was an inspiring, it was an extended coverage, and it was inspiring moment. She spoke very bravely. She spoke free of the compromise of age,